Chapter 2 Accidents. Falling into bed. Last autumn, an Englishman went to the United States for a month and visited all the important places in his guidebook. In the 4th week, he went to New York for 3 days, and on the last day of his holiday, he looked in the guidebook for the last time. "Oh, I must visit the Empire State Building. It's famous. I'll go up to the top floor. You can see all the city from there. That'll be good." The weather was cold, and it was very windy, but he walked up and up and up. He arrived at the top and looked down at the street below. The cars and people were very small. Suddenly, there was a strong wind, and he fell off the building. The people in the street stopped and watched. He fell fast. But when he was only 100 meters from the street, a big car came round the corner, with a bed on top of it. He hit the bed, not the road. Lucky man. The Flying Cow. One afternoon, a famous television newsreader drove very fast in his open-topped car along a big road. Suddenly, there was a strange noise. Thud! "What's that?" he thought. He stopped, turned round and looked. There was a cow in the back. It was dead. "I must get it out of here," he thought. "A dead cow isn't good for my nice clean car." But the cow was very heavy and he couldn't move it. So he drove to the nearest town and looked for a garage. He wanted the people in the garage to help with moving the cow. But before he arrived at the garage, he stopped at a bar for a drink. When he went into the bar, the people said, "Oh, look, it's the famous newsreader on TV. Why is he here?" Then he told them about the cow from the sky. "Never. It can't be. Is it a story for TV?" the man behind the bar asked. "No, it happened only 20 minutes ago," the newsreader said. A man in the corner of the bar started to laugh. 20 minutes ago, I drove across a bridge over the big road," he said. "There were some cows in the road. I hit a very big cow. It fell off the bridge onto the road below. I stopped and looked for it, but I couldn't find it. Now I know. It fell into your car, and you drove away with it." Look before you jump. Some years ago, Peter, a young man from a small town, wanted a motorbike. At Christmas, he asked for a motorbike, but no luck. He finished school in July and hoped for a motorbike then, but no luck. For his birthday in September, he asked again, and at last he was lucky. Peter's father gave him a big red motorbike, and he was very, very happy. On his birthday, his father said, "You must have some lessons, Peter. You must learn to ride the motorbike well." Peter had a very good teacher, Mr. Fletcher, and he was a fast learner. Mr. Fletcher was happy with his student, and one day they stood on the street in the centre of town. "Today, you must learn to stop quickly. Please ride out of town and then come back along this street. I'll suddenly jump out in front of you and say, 'Stop!' Stop as quickly as you can. Do you understand?" Yes, I do," Peter answered. Then he rode away down the street. 10 minutes later, he came back round the corner into the same street. He looked for Mr. Fletcher, but couldn't see him. "That's strange," he thought. "When is he going to jump out and say, 'Stop'?" He rode along and watched carefully, but Mr. Fletcher wasn't there. Then Peter saw a man on the street under a big red motorbike. A young man stood by him. Peter stopped, parked his bike and ran over. "Oh no," he said. "That's Mr. Fletcher." He turned to the two men and asked, "What happened?" Mr. Fletcher slowly sat up and answered, "I jumped out in front of the wrong motorbike." Don't lose your teeth. Some old men, all of them more than 75 years old, went fishing in their boat one sunny morning. At first, the sea was quiet, and they caught fish easily. Each of them got 4 or 5 small fish. They talked and laughed a lot and remembered the old days. Suddenly, Bill looked at the sky and said, "It's quite dark over there." They all looked up at the sky. "And there's a strong wind now. We must be careful." The sea was dark too, and the boat moved up and down in the wind. They stopped fishing and turned on the radio so they could hear about the weather. It was bad news. The wind was stronger and stronger, and the boat moved more and more. The men stopped talking and watched the sky. Then Bill was ill and lost his breakfast into the water, and his false teeth went in too. "Oh no," he said. "My teeth went into the water too. What can I do?" "Oh, bad luck, but you can't do much about it," his friend Fred answered. "Perhaps a fish will swallow them." And he laughed. Later, when the sea was quieter, the men started fishing again. After 10 minutes, Fred caught a very big fish. "Look at this," he said to his friends. "It's quite heavy, 6 kilos or more." He cut the fish open, took out his false teeth, and put them inside the fish. Then Fred gave the fish to Bill and said, "Hey, look! Here are your teeth, Bill. This fish swallowed them." Bill took the teeth out of the fish and put them into his mouth. Then he took them out again, smiled at Fred and said, "No, they aren't my teeth. They're too big." And he threw the teeth into the sea. Never leave your name. One Saturday afternoon, an old woman, Mrs. Roberts, sat in the park in the centre of town and talked to her friend, Mrs. Jones. They watched the people and talked about life in the town. There were a lot of cars on the road, and one young man parked his new red car near the two women and went off to the shops. After 5 minutes, a big black taxi came fast round the corner of the street and, crash, it hit the red car. "Oh no! Look at that young man's car!" Mrs. Roberts said to her friend. "Yes, it's not too good," Mrs. Jones answered. The taxi driver stopped and got out. He looked carefully at the red car and thought, "I'll leave a letter on the front window. Now, let me think." Then he looked round and saw the two women in the park. He walked across to them and asked for some paper and a pen. "I want to write a letter about the accident and leave my name and phone number," he said. He then wrote something on the paper and left it on the front window of the red car. After that, he got into his taxi and drove away. 10 minutes later, the driver of the red car came back from the shops. He looked at his car and was very angry. Then he took the letter, read it, and got angrier. Mrs. Roberts walked over to him. "What's the problem?" she asked. "I saw the taxi driver. He wrote his name and phone number on the paper." So the angry young man showed her the taxi driver's letter. It said, "Everybody thinks my name is on this paper, but it isn't." Chapter 3. Doing Wrong. Hit the floor! Jenny and Robert Slater were on holiday in America. They were young, and it was their first time away from home in England. They had a car and visited many famous and interesting places. "I want to see New York," Jenny said one morning. "Let's go there." I don't know, love. Everybody says New York's a dangerous place, and there are a lot of very strange people there," her husband answered. "We'll be careful," said Jenny. "Then we won't have any problems." So, they arrived in New York early in the evening and found a hotel. Later, they went out and drove round the streets. They didn't have any problems. "See?" Jenny said. "Nothing to be afraid of." They had dinner in a good restaurant and then went to a cinema. They arrived back at their hotel at midnight. Under the hotel was a garage, so they drove into it and left the car. It was quite dark there, and they couldn't see very well. "Where's the lift?" Jenny asked. "Over there, I think, near the door," Robert answered. "Come on, let's go. I don't like this dark place." Suddenly, they saw a very tall young man with a big black dog. They were nervous and walked past him as fast as they could to the lift. The door of the lift opened and Jenny and Robert got in. Before the doors closed, the man and the dog jumped in. 3 people and 1 big black dog in the lift. "On the floor, girl," the tall man said. Jenny and Robert were afraid now, so they quickly got down on the floor. When the lift stopped at the next floor, they stood up, gave the man all their money, and got out fast. "That man was a robber. Perhaps he had a gun. It's dangerous here," Robert said. "We're going to leave New York now." "Yes, you're right," Jenny answered. "There are some dangerous people in New York." First thing next morning, they took their room key to the desk and gave it to the woman. "There's nothing to pay, Mr. Slater," she said. "A tall young man with a nice dog came to the desk late last night and paid for your room. Oh, wait a minute. He left this for you too." She gave Robert an envelope. He opened it carefully and took out a letter. They read it together. "Here's your money, and I'm very sorry you were afraid in the lift last night. Girl is the name of my dog." Biker at the bank. Joe is a very lucky man. He loves motorbikes and he loves his job. He's lucky because he rides a motorbike in his job in London. He takes letters and important papers from one office to another. There are a lot of cars and buses in London, but Joe can ride quickly from one place to the next on his motorbike. One morning, a man telephoned Joe and said, "Please come to my office now." Joe rode as fast as he could. It took only about 10 minutes to get there. He ran up to the office on the 4th floor. The man gave him a small envelope and a big bag. "Take this envelope and the bag to the National Bank on Oxford Street and give them to the cashier. Then bring the bag back to my office as soon as possible. Go on, quickly," he said. Joe left the office and rode to the National Bank. He parked his motorbike outside the bank and went in. He gave the man's bag and the envelope to one of the cashiers. The woman opened the envelope and read the letter. She looked carefully at Joe and read it again. "Please wait a minute," she said. "I must talk to my boss." The cashier went away, and Joe waited. 5 minutes later, a lot of policemen ran into the bank. "That's him," one of the policemen said. They took Joe by his arms and pushed him into the police car. "What did I do?" he asked. "What's happening?" The policeman didn't answer. Later at the police station, one of the men gave the letter to Joe. "Here, look at this," he said. Joe took the letter and read it slowly. "Put all your money in the bag. I have a gun and I'll use it." The hair on her hands. Late one night, Harry Green was in his car in East London. He wanted to get home quickly. He remembered his wife's words that morning. "Be careful in East London, Harry. There was a story in the newspaper about a dangerous man out there. The police want to catch him. He killed some people with a knife last month in East London." There was heavy rain that night, so Harry didn't drive fast. Suddenly, he saw an old woman at the bus stop. "She'll get wet in all this rain," he thought. So he stopped the car, opened the window and spoke to the woman. "Do you want me to take you somewhere? You'll get very wet there at the bus stop." She answered and got into the car. Harry talked to the old woman and asked her a lot of questions, but she only said, Then he looked at her more carefully. She had a big bag in her hands. It was old and dirty. "She's got big, strong hands and a lot of black hair on the back of her hands. That's very strange," he thought. Harry started to think. Those big hands, all that hair on them, and then he remembered his wife's words that morning. "What can I do?" he thought. "I must get her out of the car and that big bag." Harry turned to the woman and said, "I think I've got a problem with the lights at the back of the car." He stopped the car and asked, "Can you get out and look at them for me? I don't think they're working." The old woman got out and walked round to the back of the car. She left her bag in the car next to Harry. He quickly shut the door and drove to the nearest police station. He took the bag in with him. It was quite heavy, too heavy for an old woman. A policeman took him into a small room, and Harry told him the story of the old woman with the hair on her hands. The policeman took the bag, opened it carefully, and looked inside. "I think you were very lucky, sir," he said. "Look at this." And he showed Harry a long, heavy knife. Hats on. When all the good people are in bed at night, the police go round the streets and watch the banks and shops and other buildings. One night, after midnight, Trevor Taylor, a young policeman, was in the street in the centre of town when he saw that one small shop had its door open. He looked through the door and he could see a lot of books, newspapers and cigarettes. Perhaps somebody's inside the shop, he thought. So he slowly pushed the door and walked in. He looked round but found nobody in the shop, so he called the police station on his radio. Trevor was a heavy smoker, and there were a lot of cigarettes in the shop. He quickly took a box of cigarettes and put them under his big policeman's hat. Then he went through to the back of the shop, but he didn't find anybody there. About 5 minutes later, a man came running along the street and arrived at the door. "This is my shop," he said, "and I want to thank you for seeing the open door." He looked at Trevor and asked, "Do you smoke?" Yes, I do," the young policeman answered. "Good. Here, take 3 of these boxes of cigarettes, a small thank you," he said. No, I can't. I'm very happy to help you. It's my job," said Trevor, "and I haven't a place to put them." "That's no problem," said the man from the shop. "Put them under your hat." The bank robber's mistake. The head of the big bank in the centre of town telephoned the police at about 3 o'clock one afternoon. "Come quickly! We had a robber in here. He left only 2 minutes ago." It was very easy to catch this bank robber. When the police arrived at the bank, the cashier told them about the robbery. "It was all very sudden. This man came into the bank and walked over to my window. He pushed an envelope across the desk to me with some words on it. 'Give me all the money, I've got a gun.'" "What did you do?" asked the policeman. "I looked at the envelope for a moment. I was quite nervous. Then I gave the robber all the money in my desk. It happened very fast. He ran out with the money in a green bag," she answered. "Oh, here's his envelope." And she gave the policeman the robber's envelope. When the robber left the bank, he went home. It was 3:30. He turned on the radio and listened to the news, but there was nothing about the robbery. But half an hour later, when a police car arrived at his house, he knew something was wrong. "How did you find me?" he asked. "It was easy," answered one of the policemen. "The cashier gave us your envelope with your name and address on it. So, here we are." Chapter 4. Living and dying. Dead cold. In the old Soviet Union, Russia, it was often hard to buy food. Meat was the most difficult thing to find. When people wanted to buy something, they usually had to wait in a long line before they could get it and pay for it. One day in Moscow, some years ago, there was the usual long line of people at the cashier's desk in a shop. It was winter, and the weather was quite cold. In the line, there was an old woman with a very big hat on her head. She waited quietly with the other people, but then suddenly she fell to the floor. "What's wrong with her?" somebody asked. "Get a doctor," another person said. One man in the line was a doctor, so he quickly went over to the woman on the floor. He looked at her carefully and took her hand. Then he took off her hat. Under it was a frozen chicken. "Oh, that's very sad," the doctor said. "I think she took the chicken and put it under her hat because she didn't have any money to pay for it." But the chicken was too cold. She had a frozen head. The chicken killed her. Coat from the Dead. One evening, a man called James was on the road from Oxford to London. There weren't many cars on the road because it was late. Suddenly, in the lights of his car, he saw a woman by the road. She was quite young and very pretty. "It's dangerous to walk along the road when it's dark and late," he thought. He stopped, opened the window, and asked the young woman, "Where are you going? It's dangerous to stand here at night. Perhaps I can take you to London with me." The young woman didn't answer, but she opened the door of the car and got in. James asked her a lot of questions. "What's your name? Where do you live? Why are you on the road at night? Is your family in London? Where are your friends? Have you got any money? Are you hungry?" The young woman sat next to James, but she said nothing. Not one word. She only looked at the road. Soon, James stopped asking questions, and they drove along without talking. Coming into London, there were more cars, and James had to drive more slowly. Suddenly, the young woman started to open the door, so James stopped the car quickly. They were in front of a house on a long street. The woman opened the door and got out of the car. Then she slowly walked up to the front door of the house. James watched her and thought angrily, "She didn't say thank you." 3 days later, he opened the back door of his car and found a coat. "This isn't my coat," he thought. Then he remembered the young woman. Perhaps it was her coat. He had to drive to London again that evening, so he thought, "I'll take her coat back. I remember the street and the house." He drove there, parked in front of the house, and walked up to the door. An older woman answered. "Does a young woman live here?" he asked. "I think this is her coat. She left it in my car 3 days ago." The woman looked at the coat and began to cry. "That was my daughter's coat." "Here, please give it back to her then," James said. "I can't," the woman said. She's dead. Dead? Said James. Yes, she died 5 years ago. 5 years ago? James asked quietly. Yes, on the road between Oxford and London, in an accident, the woman said. Beer today, gone tomorrow. John Buss lived in Manchester with his grandfather, Frank, an old man of 92. But Frank wasn't happy. He was in hospital. He didn't like the noise in the hospital very much, and it was too hot, he told John when he visited his grandfather one afternoon. Can I bring you something when I come next time? John asked. I can visit you again tomorrow. His grandfather answered quickly. Oh, yes, please. Bring me some beer, he said very quietly, and looked round carefully. Nobody heard him, only John. I usually drink 2 or 3 beers every day, but they don't give me any in this place. But, Grandad, you can't drink beer in here. You know that. The doctor told you. I know. Be careful. Put the beer in a bag, then nobody will see it. So the next day, John went back to the hospital with some bottles of beer in a bag and gave it to his grandfather. The old man looked in the bag, smiled and said, Oh, thank you, John. Thank you. Now I'm happy. Frank opened a bottle and drank it. He opened a second bottle and drank it. After that, he opened a third bottle. 2 days later, the doctor telephoned John. I'm sorry, Mr. Buss, but I have some sad news for you. Your granddad died last night. But he was happy. He had a smile on his face. John laughed because he remembered the bottles of beer. His grandfather liked beer, and he was always happy with a bottle in his hand. Did you bring him some beer? The doctor asked. Yes, I did, John answered. He had 2 or 3 bottles 2 days ago. Oh, I see, the doctor answered. He was happy because he had some beer. But I don't understand, John thought. I took him long life beer.